Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Future of CRE Sustainability. Today, I'm speaking with Grant Waldron, Director of Sustainability Strategy at Gaia Development. Grant, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Great to be here.
You've done a ton in this space. I think you worked on over 700 buildings spanning hundreds of millions of square feet. What, in your experience, is the biggest misconception developers still have about sustainable building that might be costing them money in the long run?
Yeah, no, great place to start. Yeah, and I'll say I've been fortunate. Gaia Development started really in the early 2000s when people were thinking about sustainability as like a core element of commercial real estate. It was sort of an afterthought, or it was kind of the hippies who were putting up solar panels. So the owner of the company actually built the first LEED speculative building ever built. It was built in Pasadena.
Wow.
And that sort of like, really started the movement that worked going down. LEED had just come out, LEED is leadership in energy and environmental design, and really is the gold standard when it comes to sustainable development. He helped get codes to require that. And then Cal Green, which really drives our building codes now, came out of some of these projects. So yeah, we've been fortunate celebrating 20 years now to worked on over 100 million square feet. But I think when it comes to, misconceptions around, sustainable development, LEED and other things is really the cost. I think sometimes people think green and they think dollar bills. I think it should be the other way around. It should be about saving money. It should be about smarter design, resiliency. And I think in the era we are right now, where a lot of money's looking at ESG and looking at resiliency, looking at future proofing your assets, I almost think right at the beginning, sustainability just only makes things easier. Another one that pops up a lot is entitlement requirements. So it's the hardest part of our job is getting, people getting things built. And, you can come to a city or development thinking about sustainability from the beginning and just really green lights a lot of things. So I think the misconception is it's harder, but honestly, I think if you are doing the right due diligence, thinking about sustainability from the beginning, it just makes things easier.
And I know you actually teach LEED certification courses. What are what's the number one mistake you see these folks making when it comes to pursuing green building certification?
Great question. So we've done kind of both. So we've done courses around accreditation. So that's, individuals like you and I getting, becoming LEED APs or LEED accredited professionals. And then we also do a lot of training courses for the industry in general. So that's going to be professionals looking to better understand how they can build LEED certified buildings. And, I think some of the things that come up a lot is, I think people tend to put certifications in their own bucket. And I actually think, whether it's, we're in California, California buildings are subjected to the Cal Green Code, which has so many alignments with LEED and has so many alignments with other green building certifications. So it's really not that much harder. It just, I think, gives you a framework to think more holistically about, not just energy, not just, water, but materials, health and wellness, renewable energy, EVs. So all those things are really bundled into LEED. And then if you look at like the International Energy Conservation Code, or IECC, which really dictates a lot of the other aspects of the country's codes, there's so many alignments. So I think one of the misconceptions is that LEED's in its own bucket over here, and then, all the other codes are over here. They don't talk. There's really so many overlaps. So yeah, I think one of the words we use a lot when we talk to clients is demystifying LEED, and just really unpacking it and saying it's really about core elements of building better buildings and building more sustainable buildings. And really the codes these days across the country are getting there. So yeah, I think it's really more about thoughtful building up front rather than large cost kind of that maybe people associate it with.
And as we move beyond just LEED certification for a developer, what are some of the other benefits, maybe even financial benefits to other green building strategies or even like renewable energy strategies for their building?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this is something that you talk a lot about, but like, some of the key ones that I think when people think about energy savings or ROI, a lot of it comes down to just, energy costs. So, solar is a huge one. But before that, like we always think about, how do you do it's energy efficiency first. So designing energy efficiency building. So that's your systems, that's your shell, that's your envelope. Once you've done that, then we're looking at how do you now offset that with renewables. So we'll do energy modeling on projects to really think through that kind of life cycle of a building and look at both those elements. Sometimes too much insulation is too much insulation. You're never going to get a payback on a certain amount of insulation, and you're better off sticking with maybe R18, and then we do renewable. So there is a balance there, and we like to nerd out a bit and find those, do that analytics and figure out what makes the most sense. So energy is, I think, where everyone starts. It shocks me sometimes if we go into like a big industrial facility that still has non-LED bulbs. And I'm just like, there you go. It's the light bulb moment. Let's start there. And you don't need to pay me to tell you that. I mean, I think if you're walking into a building with fluorescents, you know that you're leaving money on the table. It's a bummer, being in Southern California, that water just doesn't cost that much. So water is a little tough one to pencil on ROI, but we'll look at gray water systems, and there's ways to be creative in that. Most of it's landscape, honestly, in a commercial building. Your water use is mostly your landscaping and really not a lot of your building. The one that we actually are doing a lot of work around is materials. Think about the embodied carbon. So the carbon that's associated with your building materials. And, like some projects where we're looking at reducing the slab size or thickness of, concrete wall panels. You take out an inch or two from a concrete slab of 100, or 1 million square foot distribution center. It's a lot of concrete you reduce. That's a lot of carbon you saved, and that's a lot of cost. So there are some other ways that we can think about, just being more efficient, and it's not always just with energy.
Nice. Life cycle assessments of these buildings can be complex. Why should a developer care about a building's environmental impact over 50 years?
Well, it's code now in California, which I think people are now finally. We were on a call recently, and someone's like, "What's a life cycle assessment?" I just saw it in the code. So it's awesome to see how LEED and these other, frameworks have started to require that. And, a LEED building needs to do a life cycle assessment. And now every commercial building over 100,000 square feet will have to do a life cycle assessment. So what it is just a way to quantify your environmental impacts. It looks at your material procurement. It looks at your construction practices. It looks at the use of your building and then the end of life. So, I mean, the benefit really is, in finding ways to decrease your carbon emissions or decrease other environmental impacts. I think it really caught fire with a lot of corporate tenants, a lot of corporate developers or owners who are, SECs requiring you to disclose your carbon emissions. If you're a real estate developer, one of your biggest carbon emissions is going to become from constructing a building. So sometimes it takes like the financial institutes to kind of push everyone down that path. But we find like really novel and interesting ways to like look at the life cycle of a building and how that just helps you build a better building. It could be as simple as like your roofing material. A lot of buildings, will do, shingle roofs if it's residential, or on old kind of asphalt built up roofs. Cheap, they're relatively easy to repair, but they have a lot of carbon. And also you're repairing them every, 15, 20 years, where if you're doing a membrane roof, 80 mil, it's way easier to install solar. You're not repairing it as much.
Yep.
And the carbon footprint is way lower. So there's a lot of these add-ons when you start to like think of buildings holistically and not just like plumbing here, electrical here, architecture here, and you do these integrated building designs of sustainability. There's just a lot of overlap that I think LCAs in life cycle assessment or an LCA helps with.
Yep. Your expertise obviously spans a lot of different things: energy modeling, life cycle assessment. How do those disciplines work together to ultimately optimize building performance?
Great question. I think for a long time they were kind of separated. It was like you'd focus on energy here, and then the building kind of shells over here. But I think what we're starting to see now is there's an embodied carbon with your insulation or with your building shell, your cladding, your steel, your concrete, your glazing. So all of those have a carbon footprint. And then your building systems and how they interact with those shell systems, have a carbon footprint over the, lifespan of that building through operations. So I mentioned early on, like 2 months insulation is 2 months insulation. If you have a really insulated building, that's a lot more carbon. And you may not be saving that much money in terms of operations. So there's a lot of ways to overlap what we call, energy modeling and life cycle assessments together, just to build really, again, it depends on the goal too. And, if we're working on a net zero building, especially maybe a more, taller building and, in kind of infill where you have less roof space, you want to be net zero, you have to build a really efficient shell. You have to build a really efficient system. So we might think more about that. But if you're doing, low rise or an industrial facility or, 2-story commercial building, a lot more roof area, you can kind of, play a little bit more with how efficient it is. So We always like to start with client goals, building goals, and go from there. But there's so much overlap between those, and I think recently people have thought about it more, which just makes for, I don't know, much better buildings.
Energy modeling can technically predict performance, or it should. Reality, not always the case. Right?
Yeah,
Why that gap between model and actual building performance?
it's a tough one. Yeah, like we kind of break it down in like predictive energy modeling and then energy modeling.
Mhm.
And I think the hardest thing, I mean, what I'd say is it's hard to predict human behavior.
Yeah.
You're modeling for, if I was modeling a building that I would live in, I can get a much closer because I understand that I'm a little more of a hippie. I'm going to leave my lights on a little bit more. But if you're building a building for, even to build the suit where the tenant, you don't know how it's going to be occupied. So I think that's the challenge. In energy modeling too, we use, placeholders from like ASHRAE 90.1 or IECC or Title 24. So there's going to already be some inherent estimates built into your energy model that just can't be picked up by human behavior. So
Yep.
it's always challenging. So when I think about energy modeling, we also think about speculative energy modeling, and especially with solar too. Net zero buildings are challenging because of the biggest component is that, predictive energy modeling. And at the end of the day, you always just add 20%. You get as close as you can, and you add 20%. And that's just because, if you're going for a net zero certification, you don't want to all of a sudden get into the operations and realize that someone had a big plug load that you didn't know about, or servers come in, you switch from more people are driving EV cars, like stuff like that.
Yep.
You just don't know when you start a project. So a lot of times we're actually thinking about what I call spec or speculative net zero, and it's the base building loads. We're taking, plug loads are challenging, so we use best practices from like IECC or ASHRAE. And then we go off lights and main systems. And those we actually have a pretty good idea on. We know that lighting's going to be on, during the time of occupancy, and we have a good idea of what those hours are. We can, overlay weather data so we know heat and cool over the last, 2 decades. So we know when the AC is going to be running, when we're not heating. So for the shell, it's pretty easy to get really close on energy modeling. It's just humans are unpredictable, and that's the hard part.
It's always the human's fault. You've worked across solar consulting and sustainability strategy. How's the renewable energy integration, that piece, changing the design process for like new building development?
I wish it was doing more. And I think one thing that when I started my career in renewables and coming to more of the building side and thinking kind of more holistic sustainability with all aspects plugged in, it was always kind of a head scratcher when we work on an existing building and there was no, they wanted to put, carport parking or carport solar and have it plugged into the main electrical panel, but there's no conduit. So now we're ripping up, newly paved, parking stuff. I think the interplay between the two is really just like forward thinking design.
Yeah.
So it is, if you ever want to have, it's EV charging too. I think that's the biggest one we tell clients now is, whether you have to do some EV charging today for a code, or you can do a couple for a client, they're always right at the front of the building. But at some point, I mean, California's going to have all, EVs, all cars sold to be electric vehicles. Like in the next 20 years, half your parking lot or more is going to be electric vehicles. So what are you doing with the parking lot, further away from the building? So we're always telling people, lay conduit down now.
Yep.
Try to upsize your panel, but even if you just have conduit there and you have space for, increasing your electrical supply, that's enough. And then also battery storage too. Like let's add an area close to the building, but far enough for fire requirements where you can have a pad and conduit, for battery as well. So I think a lot of those things are just, best design practices. And even if you don't think you're going to do solar today or EV charging today, thinking through just the future proofing is a big one, and like those are such low cost. Like if we tell a client, hey, your roof's designed for like 4 or 5 pounds per square foot, but maybe go up to 8 or 10 for a balanced solar system, or just, a large like feed-in tariff for a community solar array. Like let's beef that up. That is a large cost. And if they don't think they're going to do solar today, they may not want to do that.
Yeah.
But the cost to put conduit in the ground before you're grading a site is so cheap for what you get as a return on that those ones are a little bit easier for someone to be like, yeah, that's a no-brainer. We'll do that. And then once they do that, maybe they're like, actually we'll go up to 7 pounds per square foot for our roof. So I think sometimes it's just finding where people are interested in And there is an overlap between them. Absolutely. Yeah. And when we work on projects, there's some forethought. Solar developers are always so happy that like someone was on the project from the beginning that knew, the nuances, the pitfalls.
Yeah, I can relate. I remember my last house when we decided to run 240 to the new island in the kitchen that we had already laid flooring for and had
Yeah.
to rip it up to lay some new conduit. That was not fun.
Yeah, exactly. No, the owner, when he put solar in his house a while ago, he initially, before he poured a slab, had done the same thing, put a bunch of conduit down. And the solar guy's like, well, I have to rip up your concrete. He's like, why would you do that? He's like, there's no conduit. He's like, no, look it, I did this. But just those are those things that are great stories. And yeah, it is someone's ripped up tile or concrete or a parking lot. They do it once and they're like, all right, the next building we build, we're absolutely putting conduit down. So
That's smart. Commissioning is something that can sometimes get overlooked in projects. What are the down the line repercussions when proper commissioning gets skipped during the process?
yeah. Oh man. I mean, we were talking about this with a client just yesterday. It's the way we were phrasing it was, the cost of not commissioning, like the errors, whether it's energy savings or issues or maintenance costs, always covers the cost to actually do commissioning. So it's like, it's one of those like no brainer things, but sometimes it's hard to tell because if you do your job commissioning right, at the end of the day, there's no issues, right?
Yeah.
We've caught them, they've been corrected. So it's sometimes you almost need to quantify the errors. You're like, hey, we realized that the hot water heating wasn't working, or your belts were on backwards, or this was set to heating when it should have been in cooling mode.
Yeah.
So you almost need to like find a way to quantify that to show a client that you saved this money. I think that's, there's the dollars really, speak to groups. But, I think some of the other big ones too, commissioning is really focused on your energy system. So it just is a great way, whether you're a spec developer, handing this over to a tenant to make sure that they're not calling you in the first couple months saying, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. It's just a good look. But the big one we're starting to see now is solar commissioning. People are commissioning solar systems and you're commissioning your arrays, but it's coming in, we're a third party. We're not the commissioning. The building police is looking at, how things were connected correctly. So we're doing like thermal testing with thermal guns to make sure there's no like, potential areas for fire, making sure racking's installed correctly. And I think what bums me out is you get, one solar fire and everyone freaks out that that's going to happen to them. And those are such like small, rare issues. But I think someone coming out and saying we're a third party, we have all this accreditations, we can do the testing that's going to alleviate any of those potential errors that pop up very infrequently. So we like that just because we want more solar to be installed on projects. Even we see these big commercial buildings that have huge roofs. There's no solar on them. So that's been one that we're seeing more people do, which has been nice just to see. I think it alleviates any issues. Also, insurance companies are liking that too as a way to say, okay, hey, we're not really as concerned anymore because you went through the proper channels to have this commissioned.
ESG reporting is now mandatory for many firms. What are the sustainability metrics that should be most important to CRE investors now and into the near future?
Yeah, ESG is, it's the evolution has really kind of been a bit like this. ESG was sort of in a corner for many years. And then, in 2020, 21, it really started to grow. And I think now we're even seeing a new evolution where some clients are moving away from the term ESG and rebranding it. So rather than, using ESG or corporate social responsibility, we have to think about what are the metrics that people are tracking. And for us, I think the two big ones, the one was for a long time was carbon and looking at your carbon emissions from, your operations or from your construction or from your fleets or, company vehicles, but now also converting that to dollars. And I think at the end of the day, with our large, developers, if you're a developer and you're leasing, your developer it's selling, at the end of the day, it's a business. So you're looking at it from a financial return. And then publicly traded companies, like that's at the end of the day what their main requirement is. So we are now trying to convert carbon to dollars or carbon to cost.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really great way to communicate really all the work that we do to kind of any person, the lay person, because you can talk about energy savings, you can convert that to dollars really easily. Same with water, but carbon's tough. Like embodied carbon, we saved, 2 million kilograms of CO2. Like no one can, it's hard to, what does that look like? What is it? Can I put that on my hand? So then converting that to, okay, that came from steel saving, that came from concrete savings. What's the cost of a cubic yard of concrete? Okay, we saved $250,000 in concrete, and that equated to this. I think those are really interesting. A lot of people said like, oh, you save this much carbon, it's like 10,000 trees or 100,000 cars.
Yeah.
I think those are good for certain people. So we always have these equivalencies. But if you can anchor on the dollar,
Yep.
everyone understands that. So I think that's where we're going to see the movement go back to. It's still sustainability is a core focus for so many companies, but you need to be able to communicate sustainable value really as dollars and cents. And that's where you're going to get the most years.
Yep. When you're looking at ESG strategy, are there sustainability initiatives that maybe institutional level investors are valuing like more than most developers actually realize and are maybe underestimating the value of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, from institutional capital, I think some of the big ones, one that's been really big for a long time is certifications. And that's really where our company's grown. You see a lot of these, large, pension funds like CalPERS, CalSTRS is required. Anything they're funding in real estate has to be LEED certified. And I think that was an easy way for these, institutional organizations to basically say, we're giving money and we're doing the right thing. So if someone's giving us money, we're doing something good. And now you're starting to see ESG funnel in there, having ESG reports. But yeah, I think certifications has always been a big one. Every, traditional kind of institutional capital company requires LEED certification on any building they build. I thought we were going to see renewables. Some groups are looking at that, but I think since renewables are somewhat case by case, they've kind of strayed away, and it says it depends on the project. One we're seeing now that most of them are requiring is a life cycle assessment, like we talked about earlier. So saying you have to quantify the carbon footprint of this facility that you built. Those are big ones. And then there's some general ones just around, certain surveys around construction and, pollution, how much you're recycling from your construction waste. All of those things kind of pop into it. But the nice thing is LEED covers all of that too. So I think by just saying require LEED, they cover kind of all the bases, which seems to be kind of the most popular one.
Now, when we talk about tenants, their expectations around sustainability continue to evolve. What demand are you seeing from tenants that might be catching developers by surprise?
Yeah, the tenants are becoming way more savvy. That's the first one. So it's interesting. There's a term that we get thrown out a lot called a green lease. So you have your standard lease, but that's kind of like dictates all the sustainability things. One of the most interesting ones has been roof rights in your lease as it comes to renewables. You lease your building, you're kind of leasing everything, and the roof comes along with that. So, we've seen projects where, it's in a great community solar program, and the developer who they own the building, they want to put solar up, but they technically don't have the rights to that. The roof rights are in the lease with the tenant. So there's some interesting negotiation back and forth. Maybe the tenant doesn't want it. And so it just becomes, a situation that can be avoided. And we're seeing now roof rights being retained by the building owner in almost all leases. So certain things like that, like being pulled out of leases, which most people didn't think about. So some of those I think are unique, but tenants just, are asking for renewables. We also have a lot of owners that come to us and say, hey, our tenant wants solar, or our tenant wants EV, or our tenant wants an energy efficiency, study to understand how they could save more money or be more sustainable. Occasionally we see, a building that's, LEED certified, during the leasing process be like a requirement. So a lot of Fortune 50 companies, they'll only go into a certified building. So things like that. But yeah, the tenant's definitely more savvy. I will say that at the end of the day, I don't think someone is leasing. They're looking for their core requirements. So it's going to be location, square footage, all of those things that come first. But if you have two buildings or similar buildings in a similar area, sustainability is really, I think, that next level that helps people lease buildings. So we talked to a lot of developers who, I think it's a tough market now for office. Industrial, there's a lot being built right now. Some of this maybe oversaturation. So, and even honestly, multifamily too. There's a lot of just, regular consumers that care about that. So finding ways to build smarter and then helping communicate that to tenants is a big one.
I like that. I know you said water sustainability savings, not so easy in California at least, but for others, big opportunity. What innovative water management strategy have you implemented personally or seen implemented that delivered maybe like outsized results?
The biggest one is gray water. It's any way to reuse water twice is gonna be huge. So actually, San Francisco is a great case study as a city that they require all buildings over. I think it might have dropped, but it most recently was 250,000 square feet. So all of your large towers in SF have to have gray water. So basically, these are taking your shower or laundry water, treating them on site, and then using that water again in the building for toilet flushing. It's such a unique way to be smarter with your water, and there's a cost savings. Again, those systems aren't cheap, so the ROI on them, is over 10 years.
Yep.
But that's what the cost of water today, and I just know water's going to get more expensive. So that's one that just is it makes a lot of sense. The technology for that is really robust. And then you can get, a little more crazy. We see composting toilets in some commercial facilities. It's a little less common. There's some more nuances with that, but gray water is such an easy one.
I believe you've been co-chair of the USGDC Emerging Professionals Committee. You
Mhm.
probably have a lot of insight into the sort of the young professionals coming up through the world. What do you think are one of the most important skills for those emerging sustainability
Yeah.
professionals to possess?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying, one of the reasons I got involved with that committee was, I think early on in my career, I had, people help pull me up into roles. And I think that, part of the reason I wanted to get into that was to give back, and say, how can I help that next generation? You talk to young, professionals graduating college or switching careers. It's always that like treadmill where they want to get into a job that's entry level, but it requires 3 years of similar experience. And it's like, well, how do you get that? So, yeah. So what I've realized is sustainability isn't niche. Every industry needs sustainability, whether you're in construction, whether you're in finance, whether you're a developer, like it touches all aspects of that. So,
Mhm.
I think my advice to people is like, if you're passionate about sustainability, you're also probably passionate about a specific aspect of it. Like it's so broad. Our team is really diverse. We have people we're all sustainability experts and passionate about the broad scope, but others are experts in commissioning or solar or carbon. So I always tell people, it's like, what are you passionate about? What excites you in that industry? Use that passion, because I think that's just contagious. If you like what you're doing, you're going to be able to articulate it better. So it's always just, I think that's the thing, is there's so many opportunities in the space, and we need it. I mean, that frankly, the reason I got involved and the reason a lot of people at our firm are involved in sustainability is like, we're in a climate crisis. And it's like, how do we find ways to decrease carbon emissions? So anyone that's smart in, whether it's finance, construction, engineering, software, like all of those touch sustainability or have a way to, to support and give back. So yeah, I always like helping educate and provide resources when I can.
Net zero buildings are becoming more mainstream. What are the operational challenges that owners face in maintaining net zero energy performance?
It goes back to human behavior, right? You design a building that produces, 400,000 kilowatt hours per year. You can't use 400,001 kilowatt hours because you're not technically net zero anymore. So I think that's one of the challenges. One of the things that, we talked about commissioning, but ongoing commissioning or energy audits, I think are so important for maintaining your facilities. So that's one of those things that we always recommend is you should have some sort of, ongoing commissioning plan where someone's coming out and checking set points. All it takes is someone on a really hot day, turns the air conditioning way down.
Yep.
They bypassed your controls. So now every day your building is now cooling to 69 degrees when typically it was at 72, and your energy model and your solar was sized at that set point. So those are those human things, I think just having someone be able to come in, and I think a lot of the work you guys do, it's, building management systems and having ways to monitor buildings. If you get like, that's another thing that we haven't talked about so far, but building monitoring is such a big space right now. So
Yep.
people can put in building monitors, shadow metering to be able to look at not just whole building, but individual systems. That helps for predictive maintenance. That helps for things that get out of whack on set points. That makes our job so much easier when those go in day one. So we're always telling clients, put in smart metering, because it's hard to go out and do commissioning or ongoing commissioning if all you see is the utility bill. You have to really start opening things up and looking into kind of the set points. But that's such a big one. And I think that goes beyond just net zero buildings, any building, even if you just care about operational costs. That's the cheapest way to save money is having someone go out who's a building expert and just take a look at everything. Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, you're so right. It's like data is everything. I mean, people make these huge investments in these sustainable initiatives to energy systems, and then they're not, people make mistakes to your point. Systems break, tooling breaks. If you're not looking at the data consistently and understanding how things are performing, you're probably costing yourself a lot of money in the long term.
Yeah, totally.
Speaking of costs, what is a sustainability practice that might on the surface appear like it's a big CapEx or OpEx expense, but actually saves money, even within the first few years of implementation?
I honestly, we're talking about commissioning, but I think ongoing commissioning is that one.
Yeah.
And I say that for two reasons. One is most people aren't thinking they need it. So we're coming to them and saying, hey, this is the cost for us to come out and do an audit, put together a report. We follow certain ash rate guidelines. And they might be like, we don't need that. And we're telling them, we'll likely save you the cost of that report and that study and then some.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an example of where we did that. But until someone's done it, they don't necessarily know they need that service. So I think that's one where oftentimes it's overlooked. But in with all of our vehicles, we're doing, 5,000-mile maintenance. Like people do that. That's just a built-in practice. And people have that for HVAC specific systems, but it's always in a silo, not someone coming out and doing a full building, ongoing audit or commissioning. And it's just, there are so many low, no cost options just in set points and calibration that save you money day one. I don't think we've ever done a energy audit or commissioning study where we haven't been able to recoup our cost in year one with some, adjustments. And then obviously there's opportunities for, improvements down the line. Your HVAC is, coming up on its useful life. Let's look at ways to, update that, install a more efficient system. Maybe we install an electric system and so we're decarbonizing. But we can start to build a plan from there around your long-term goals. But short-term, I think that's such an important one that oftentimes overlooked. And sometimes the challenge too is who pays for it. We go, the building owner doesn't necessarily care. I mean, they want the building to last, so they can continue to have tenants, but they don't care about energy savings necessarily because that's a pass through to the tenant. The tenant cares about energy savings, but maybe doesn't want to fork out, $20,000 to have some of these studies done. So there's just that balance is finding out who, how do you pitch that? Is it a cost share between the tenant and the owner? And then just kind of proving that value out. But that's one of those ones that always makes sense. It's just, making sure that you're explaining it in the right way or getting the right person to listen.
That's the key. If we look ahead 5, 10, 15 years, is there a single piece of actionable advice you would give to real estate investors and developers around future proofing their portfolio against climate risk, regulation, et cetera?
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit, but the biggest one is, it is future proofing, but I think it's really, the industry is going to move towards electrification.
Yep.
And that's electrification of vehicles, that's adding more renewables, and that's getting rid of gas. So any way that you can future proof your facility that way is going to make things way easier to attract tenants, to retain tenants, to align with ESG goals. I think there's going to be a bombshell moment in 2029 when everyone's coming up for lease renewals and Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all these big companies have their 2030 net zero goal and they're sitting in a facility. They're not their core facilities because those are all, they're building those ground up. They're amazing, but it's going to be those ancillary facilities. They're either going to drop their lease to get into an electric, net zero or get into a, carbon-free facility. That's going to be a really interesting time. So I think if those tenants are what you want, or you're thinking about codes, coming in for existing building codes, future proofing for electrification is the big one. And there's multiple aspects of that, but it's laying down conduit for future EV, it's laying out conduit and future planning for battery storage, it's beefing up your roof and installing the right conduit for solar. And it's really having the ability to, put in electric systems without having gas systems. So that's where I think the industry is going. Everyone's talking about electrification. People do it on flagship projects, but when you have these lease renewals and companies are saying we're going to be net zero, we can't really be net zero in a facility that has gas, so unless you want to buy carbon offsets, but a lot of their plans don't allow carbon offsets. So I think that's the movement. I think electrification is where it's at. And if you want to be net zero in 2030, you got to start today.
Love that. All right. Last bit here, lightning round, quick hit answers on just a couple questions that are
Okay.
top of mind. Solar, wind, nuclear, battery storage, other. What is your bet for the fastest growing renewable energy source in commercial real estate in the next 5 years?
I'm going to keep hedging my bet solar. Solar's been the most. It's going to keep being the most.
I tend to agree. What is one prop tech solution you've seen implemented that kind of blew you away with what it delivered?
It's got to be shadow metering and kind of like smart metering.
No, that's making a huge difference for so many. What is the first sustainability metric every person should be checking when they wake up in the morning and grab their coffee?
I'm going to say carbon, but it could be dollars and cents, like I talked about as well. But I'm going to go carbon because that's what I think about every day.
Fair enough. Complete this sentence. The biggest myth about green buildings is
It costs way too much.
no. And last one, you've got unlimited capital. You're a real estate investor. You've got money to invest in one sustainable property upgrade right now. What's the first thing you do?
Wow. First of all, I love that image you painted. What great, right? Yeah. I mean, I like to think that the building I already built has everything that it needs. But yeah, I think battery storage. I think especially in California with, kind of the new net billing requirements, battery storage. That's going to be the other big one.
Yeah, firms up that energy source. Grant, this has been awesome. If people want to learn more about what you're doing, what Gaia Development offers, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, check me out on LinkedIn or reach out via email. Our email's on our website. We're doing a lot of great work, whether you just have questions or, want to chat. I'm not short-winded. I like to talk about sustainability. I definitely nerd out. So, it's been a pleasure, Sean.
Awesome. Is that GaiaDevelopment.com?
GaiaDevelopment.com. You got it.
Wonderful. To all my listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Future of CRE Sustainability. I'll see you next time.